Chip Chapman is a retired British Army Major General. Welcome to our program, General Chapman.
Nice to see you again, Daniel.
Russian dictator Vladimir Putin is confident that his army will be able to break through Ukrainian defense lines and capture the whole 4 Ukrainian regions until the end of this year, according to Bloomberg sources close to Kremlin. Do you believe in that, and what is your assessment of this objective of Putin's army?
Well, firstly, let's go back to the grand strategic objective. So overall, in terms of a long period of time, maybe decades, I still think that he has an imperialist objective, which is to regain lost territories and spheres of influence. It is this narrative which is building up that Ukraine might be for Russia an internal matter, in that the USSR has never been dissolved. That is one of the conditions they seem to be setting for the future. If you look at the operational objectives for 2025, I think there is little doubt that he would like to capture all of the Donbass this summer, and that he would also like to certainly get a toehold in both Sumy and Kharkiv, partly maybe to set the condition for a future annexation of that, again in terms of negotiations, saying that that's another territorial reality on the ground that Ukraine have to take cognizance of and negotiate away from his perspective, because I don't think they're going to negotiate themselves away from the oblasts in Ukraine. As to the chances of them doing that, at the moment I would say they're pretty low, but like all these things, there are various variables in war and nothing is certain. For example, would there be a collapse in will? I don't see that, but the number of drone strikes, cruise missile strikes, and ballistic missile strikes, and the tempo of them over the weekend can weaken the resistance of the civilian population. Don't think that's cracking at all yet, but it is that sort of Clausewitzian trinity, as we call it, that you don't only need the army to be fighting on your behalf, you need a robust and resilient population, and you need the government to be all in sync in a regulated triangle. I think that is still there for the Russians. I also always go back to what Budanov said last September, that 2025 is the period when Russia would, or the summer of 2025 is the period when Russia would seek to achieve those operational objectives there. But that also, it's the period of greatest concern for them in terms of when they might reach the peak of their economy beginning to decline, and therefore they need to try and seek a solution now, or in his words, the two things which would lead to a ceasefire are the need to regenerate in time before they came again, or regenerate their economy, because you just can't keep going indefinitely unless you're supported in ends, ways and means terms by other countries. And again, that is the other variable about what support they might get from Iran, China, North Korea. And that's also, of course, where the notion of future sanctions, certainly from the Senate or the legislature in America, comes in, not yet from the executive.
Also, Russian dictator Vladimir Putin has ordered his army to create so-called security buffer zone along the border with Ukraine. Also, Russian army has begun its offensive deep inside the Sumy region. Russian sites 4 border villages in Ukrainian Sumy region. However, this advance has been halted by the resistance of the Ukrainian armed forces. What is your assessment of this Russia's war efforts in the Sumy region to create so-called buffer zone?
Well, I think the buffer zone from a Russian perspective is a movable feast. It's a creeping buffer zone. In terms of the grand strategic objective, I think that they see all of Ukraine as the buffer zone. That's certainly the sort of language which Medvedev is using at the moment. So they will always move that again. At the moment, they're seeing it as a buffer zone for the strikes that Ukraine are doing over the border. So from a tactical perspective, that would make sense from a Russian from a Russian viewpoint. But let's not kid ourselves what they mean by a buffer zone. They mean extending Russian sphere of influence all the way to the former those countries which are now part of NATO.
Also, according to Sky News, 50,000 Russian force is stationed just across the border from the city of Kharkiv. What are the chances for another full-scale attack on Ukraine, and do you feel that Russia has enough resources to conduct large-scale operations, full-scale operations, such types of operations which were conducted after the beginning of full-scale invasion of Ukraine?
Well, as I said just now, but in another context, there's always this mismatch between ends, ways, and means. If 50,000 people were an exploitation echelon with thousands of tanks and AFVs on day one of this war, you could say that might happen. But obviously, the changing character of war and the fact that the resource of maneuver has degraded of the Russians means that their ability to capture ground in a meaningful way, rather than a slugging and slow bite and hold way, means that their ability to capture ground and exploit is very caveated and very slow. As I've said a number of times, it's the chicken pecks grain by grain. And with the losses each day, 50,000 people is not something that will sustain you unless it's continuously replenished. So at some stage, they will meet the point of culmination. That is, in military terms, the culminating point is when you can go so far and can go no further. And I don't think they'll be able to go much further in any of the current operations in a meaningful way. That doesn't mean they won't capture little bits of ground, but they're generally meaningless bits of ground. The odd village here and there is a tactical success, a minor tactical success. It doesn't have operational significance.
Also, according to the Washington Post, Russia's battlefield strength has started to wane, and it could run into serious shortages of manpower and weaponry until the end of this year, according to senior US and European officials and military experts. For how long Putin can continue his war against Ukraine and his war effort?
Well, I think in terms of the manpower, that is one of the choices he potentially has to make this summer. So we know that there is a sort of large amount of money being placed on getting contract soldiers. That won't sustain the manpower required at the front and to exploit further than they are currently going in a meaningful sense. In order to do that, they would have to mobilize the manpower. But then there's a mismatch between the personnel side of capability and the equipment side of capability, which is why we're seeing more and more sort of Mad Max type assaults with trying to get across the killing zone on motorbikes and all-terrain type vehicles to try and use speed as an enabler to get into the frontline positions of the Ukrainians. That again is not a way either to meaningfully do something at the operational level, nor to supply an army in a meaningful sense at the operational level.
Let's cover also recent Trump's statements toward Vladimir Putin. Trump said Sunday that Russian President Vladimir Putin has gone absolutely crazy. Do you feel that Trump is getting really frustrated about Putin's actions, and could this lead to serious decisions, sanctions against Russia, or even increased support for Ukraine?
Well, the one thing that you can say, and the word that you can always apply, I think, to President Trump is mercurial, which in English is that someone who's subject to sudden or unpredictable changes of mood or mind. Now, we've often thought for the last 3 or 4 months that the pressure strategy should be put on Russia, when often Trump has been putting a pressure strategy more on Ukraine. That is, he's rewarding the aggressor and almost at times been setting the conditions where he expects Ukraine to give such significant concessions that it would lead to a surrender peace and not a just peace. I think that Trump caveated what he said about Putin by really diluting a bit at the end, by also saying that President Zelensky was also an obstacle and a bit of a pain. So he rather diluted his message by doing that. What I do expect we'll probably see is that the Senator Graham Blumenthal axis will sponsor in the Senate a bill for this maybe 500 the tariff of 500% on those nations which are supporting Russia. The Senate, of course, is more of an independent entity than the House of Representatives, where Trump still has more sway amongst those. So I see really a kind of battle between the power of the legislature and the power of the executive in America. And this, I think, is one of those curious things where Trump quite likes Putin, because he sees him able to take action without the need to pander to anyone, in the way that in a democracy, of course, you have to take other forces into play. So what I would really hope is that a number of things happen. Firstly, there are increased sanctions, including the secondary sanctions, in the way that the 17th set of sanctions has been sort of passed by the EU. Secondly, I'd like to see the more military support, or continued military support, including long-range weapons from the Americans. And thirdly, I'd still like to see an undercutting of the Russian oil capability, not only via that sanctions and secondary sanctions package, but also by some sort of notion of absolutely degrading in economic terms the shadow fleet which is transporting the oil around the globe.
You just mentioned about long-range strikes inside Russia. German Chancellor Friedrich Merz says that Western leaders, Western countries have lifted its restrictions on use of Western-made long-range weapons by Ukraine. Can you imagine a scenario in which the US will provide Ukraine with additionally long-range weapons and would allow to actually strike inside Russia?
I can, but I would again at the moment say that is just a scenario rather than a certainty. Like all these things on long-range strike, you really have to understand a bit about how targeting works. And the targeting, when you've got very expensive smart weapons which use GPS guidance for their final terminal things, comes from satellites, space power, and most of that space power is American space power. That is why America is so crucial in the targeting sector to do these long-range strikes, and why it's necessary to keep America on side if you want to achieve that across all the panoply of the future weapon systems that will come. And indeed, there are different warheads in some of these different systems which have been already supplied. And the Taurus cruise missile from the Germans, which we haven't seen used yet and given freely by the Germans, also has a different targeting metric than some of the French and UK systems. And that could be pretty devastating, for example, on the Kerch Bridge, where it's more likely to be of greater utility than Storm Shadow or Scalp, for example.
And is it possible to conduct this targeting without the commitment, the support from the United States?
It would be pretty difficult for long-range targeting without most of the US satellite space power. If you look at the thousands of space satellites that they have, including military satellites, it outweighs anyone else in the world by a quantum level. So not to have those available would probably degrade the targeting process to a fairly significant level.
And from your perspective, do you feel that the US still provides Ukraine with this targeting information for Ukraine to conduct strikes, at least with Storm Shadow cruise missiles and French-made Scalp missiles?
Well, we know that one of the things which was taken away after the spat in the White House in February was that ability, the targeting information, the intelligence information which you need to do. a lot of that was reinstigated and given back to the Ukrainians. So what the full scope of that is would be pretty secret, I think, at the moment. But I'm sure there is some of that in train at the moment. How far the caveat would go in sort of time and space? Are they allowed to conduct operations beyond a certain line using certain American satellite systems for the final terminal guidance on that? I don't think we would know in an open forum. That would be highly sensitive information.
Also, according to Wall Street Journal, US President Donald Trump finally is considering the possibility of imposing sanctions on Russia as soon as this week. Moreover, US President Donald Trump, according to Kyiv Post, also considers to lift all Biden-era restrictions on Ukraine's long-range capabilities. What could this mean?
Well, again, a week in politics is a long time, and the legislature is on leave this week, so it's not in session. It will be in early June. So it's whether the pressures from the legislature, the Senate and House of Representatives, come together with President Trump when he's still in a mood that Putin is a kind of the bad guy. Not that that's a phrase he's ever used, but I think one thing that the Russians have done far better than the Americans have at the moment is, we have to remember that Putin is an ex-KGB guy. Every intelligence agency in the West has human factors analysts. I would guess that when Putin has any sort of meeting or dialogue with Trump, he's absolutely briefed by the human factors analysts of the best way to talk to him in a way that plays to his ego, so that it does look like that Trump is that Putin is a good guy from his perspective. Now, they would look at things, for example, like some people would say that President Trump suffers from a thing called the hubris nemesis complex. He absolutely believes, I think, in the great man theory of international relations, which is that two or three guys, because of the leaders of the country, can have a great relationship and sort out every geopolitical problem in the world. That's not really how geopolitics works. Further, his worldview is eroded by this notion that, hey, if you stop the war, you'll be able to trade with us, oh, Mr. Putin. Again, nations don't go to war for economic reasons. They are not the accountants and bookkeepers of the world. They look at power and the accumulation of power. And that's when you come back to the grand strategic objectives of Russia, which is absolutely to regain lost territory and spheres of influence. That notion, again, that Putin said many, many times, that the greatest geopolitical disaster of the 20th century was the demise of the Soviet Union.
You just mentioned that Trump is being played by Vladimir Putin, is being manipulated. Why can't Trump's national security team prevent him from being manipulated by Putin?
Well, one of the differences between President Biden and President Trump is that President Biden was always a interagency man, that he took briefings from the interagency machinery. That is not the way I think that Trump does business. He thinks he is this sort of genius who knows everything, and therefore his ability and attention to detail and to take those detailed briefs that you need to be all informed from across the range of agencies is probably just not there in the way that it was under the Biden regime and the way it would be for Putin, I think.
You just mentioned about the intelligence briefing. I suggest it was the Washington Post reported that Donald Trump does not really like to participate in this intelligence briefings conducted by CIA and other US intelligence agencies. What could this mean, and why does he hesitate to listen to his top intelligence officials, top intelligence professionals?
Well, you have to firstly understand how the intelligence agencies work in America. So there are 18 intelligence agencies in America. The CIA is not primus inter pares for the briefing of the briefing of the president is the ODNI, Officer and Director of National Intelligence, which also has a problem because obviously the head of ODNI has also been fairly friendly to Russia in the long term. So you have sort of people who are just not used to working in those positions, don't have the technical expertise to head those agencies, which we've really seen in the past and in past presidencies. That can be a problem both in unilateral briefing and in collating the briefing of all the agencies to make sure that you don't have a slit between the cup and the lip. And that really should be the role of ODNI, primus inter pares, in briefing the president. But of course, that doesn't stop the CIA or some of the other big eight, as they call it, from having access to brief the president. But I just don't think he has that attention span and has that as his way of working.
Let's cover also preparation for the NATO summit in Hague this June. According to the American media outlets, NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte tries to prevent a clash between President Zelensky and President Trump during this summit, and that's why the program of summit was shortened, and it's probably the case that President Zelensky will not participate in the main dinner of NATO leaders. However, he could be involved in the NATO forum regarding the defense spending and military industrial production. What is your expectation about this NATO summit in Hague, and do you feel that this conference could change something in Trump's stance on NATO and on Ukraine?
Well, as I said, Daniel, a week in politics is a long time. I think it's 4 weeks or thereabouts till the next NATO conference. That's absolutely really what I've been getting at, in that most international relations really work on the basis that protocols and procedures which precede any meeting are the things that set the tone and the way that the agenda and business is done. So at this range, 4 weeks out, and with the volatility of all the things that are going on with the relationship between Trump, Putin, and within NATO and President Zelensky, and I think there's still a lot to play for in the left and right of arc of what might be discussed and what might come out of that. So I think it would be absolutely premature at a month's notice to try and make any predictions of what might come out of that NATO summit.
Thank you, General Chapman, for your time and for your support for Ukraine, and glory to Ukraine.